Good morning, year four. Well, what a day. It's awful outside, isn't it? I think if I had hair, it'd be wet through. So maybe that's a bonus to not having any. Anyway, on we go. So, not good news, is it? Everything was going well, but now things have gone a little bit wrong. So we'll find out what happens. This chapter's called An Orphan Just the Same. They let Marty and me live on for a while on no worries. By day, we'd be out looking for work in other boatyards, but times were hard. There was just no work to be had in any of the boatyards in Newcastle or Sydney, nor anywhere else for as far as we could discover, and boat building was all we could do. Letters came from Auntie Meg's, saying we could always come home for a while if we wanted to, that there was always a place for us there, and plenty of work too. I can't believe how stupid we were actually not having taken her up on her offer. I remember reading her letters over and over again, trying to decide whether to go, but for all sorts of reasons, Marty and I just decided against it. He said, and at the time I thought he was right about it too, that you should never go back. It's like giving up. And we both loved the sea, we both loved the boats. We were determined to find work that kept us near the sea, or even on it, preferably. Those months we trudged the harbours and boatyards of Sydney, looking for work for both of us, and it took its toll. But it took its toll on Marty in particular. He was always the one who had kept me going through most of our difficult times ever since we were little. Now he had just about given up. I was the one who had to get him up in the morning when he wanted just to lie there. And with every fruitless day, with every rejection, I watched him sink deeper into silence of despair. I tried to pull him out of it, to joke him out of it. I tried to keep him positive, but it was no good. Every night now he'd want to stay out, late. Time and again I had to drag him back, and more than once he got into some fights. He wasn't happy, he was angry. The money that he was saving was running out fast, and worse, I could feel that the two of us were beginning to drift apart. Before we'd always done everything together, but now he'd go out in the evenings on his own. I could tell he didn't want me around anymore. We never fell out, not as such. He was just going his own way, and there was nothing I could do about it. There was one morning when I couldn't get him out of bed no matter what I did, so I left him there and went off job hunting on my own. As usual, I didn't find anything, but I was gone all day. When I came back to No Worries in the evening, Marty had gone. I thought he'd gone out drinking, that he'd be back later. Even when a couple of policemen came the next morning early and woke me up, I wasn't that worried. I just thought he'd picked a fight and ended up in the police station for the night. I recognised one of the policemen. He'd interviewed me on the night of the fire. I was half asleep when they told me, so I didn't really understand. Not at first. It was about Marty, they told me, and I had to come with them. I still didn't understand. We've got a witness who saw it happen, said the policeman I'd met before. Someone who knew him. But all the same, you need to come and take a look. Then they told it to me straight. Marty had been drunk. He'd been in the dinghy, leaping from boat to boat in the harbour, messing around. He'd fallen in and just never come back up again. They tried to find him, but it was dark. Then this morning they found him. I'm still trying to believe it ever happened, even now, all these years later. The shock of it and the pain goes through me every time I think of it. They took me to see him in the hospital. It wasn't Marty. Well, it was, but it was just his body. I felt nothing. I tried to feel something. I stayed there with him for hours. But you can't feel emptiness. They brought me back to No Worries, and I found Auntie Meg's sitting on her suitcase waiting for me. It was the strangest thing. She'd woken up a couple of nights before and had known at once we needed her. When I told her, all she said was, "I'm too late then." There were just the two of us there for Marty's funeral. We buried his ashes up on the hill where the Bushmen had left us that day, where Auntie Meg's had first found us. I recited a few verses from the Ancient Mariner, ending with the line that I knew he loved most of all. Alone on a wide, wide sea. I'm glad I did that, because that poem is not just about a sea voyage. It's about a journey through life, and about the loneliness of that journey. It was the right thing to read. Auntie Megs took me in again. She took care of me all that she could, but now there were two spirits in that house with us, Mick and Marty. She had photos of them on the mantelpiece side by side, but they were omnipresent, particularly, I remember, when we were sitting in silence together, as we often did in the evening. So much was the same, but so much wasn't. Henry's hole was still there under the veranda steps, still full of his beloved hats. Barnaby wandered the paddock, shadowing Big Black Jack. The two had clearly become quite inseparable. But Auntie Meg's old horse had gone. Auntie Meg's and I still did everything the three of us had always done together. She didn't have the cows any more, just one nanny goat for her milk. But we still went up to the main road to rescue the orphan marsupials, her little fellows. We still kept them in the compound. From time to time we'd make the long journey up to Marty's Hill, as we called it now, see if one or two of them would go back into the wild. I had never been quite sure of Auntie Meg's age, but she must have been about 75 or 80 by now, and I had been in my late 20s. As the years passed, she stayed just as active in her mind, just as spirited. But as she said, her poor old body doesn't work like it should. She didn't go out walking much these days. Her legs pained her. She never said anything much about it, but I could see it. She moved more slowly, more stiffly. But she could ride all day through, and it wouldn't bother her a bit. On the contrary, she was happier upon the horse than anywhere else. She told me once that God had given her 4 legs to gallop with and a tail to whack the flies with, that he'd just made a big mistake with the rest of the human race, that's all. And gallop she did too. Nothing she liked better. She said it made her feel alive, and I knew what she meant, because that's exactly how I'd felt out sailing with Marty on Mr. Dodds's boat. With the wind in my face and the sails straining above me, in the salty spray on my lips, my longing for the sea never left me. Auntie Meg's had a good quick end, the best you can have, the doctor said when he came. She'd gone out with her torch to check her family of animals in the compound, as she always did late in the evening. I was sitting stargazing on the veranda when she came back. She sat down beside me and said she thought that she smelt rain in the air. Then she fell silent. I thought she'd gone to sleep. She'd often do that out on the veranda on warm evenings, and in fact, that's just what she had done. She'd gone to sleep, a long sleep, a final sleep. The whole town came up to Marty's Hill the day she was buried, and there were dozens of bushmen there too. I don't think I quite realised until then just how much she was loved. I put her ashes next to Marty's, a photo of Mick with them. When everyone left, I stayed up there and recited the whole of the Ancient Mariner for them both. As I walked away, I felt like an orphan all over again. A grown-up one maybe, but an orphan just the same. Things fall apart. If there's one part of my life I'd like to forget entirely, it was the next 15 years or so. I suppose you could call them my years in the wilderness. I shan't enjoy writing about them, but I've got to do it. Liked or not, I just can't miss it out. Luckily for me, quite a lot of it is lost in a fog of forgetfulness. Perhaps that's what happens sometimes. Perhaps it's an automatic survival system that helps you muddle through. Maybe the memory just says, that's enough. I'm overloading with pain here and I can't cope, so I'm switching off. But it doesn't switch off entirely. So you remember, but thankfully only dimly through the fog. Sometimes though, the fog does clear, and you see the icebergs all around. You can hear them groaning and grinding, and you just want to sail through the field of icebergs and out the other side, or you just long for the fog again. I'll tell you about the icebergs now, and like most icebergs are, they're unexpected and very unwelcome. After Auntie Meg's died, I stayed on living at the Ark, doing what she'd done, living as we'd always lived. I didn't need much in the way of money. I had milk and eggs and vegetables. I lived a bit like a hermit. I rarely went into town and no one else came to see me. I wasn't unhappy, not even lonely. But then of course I wasn't alone, I had the animals. And like Dr. Dolittle, I talked to them all. I think I talked to Big Black Jack more than I'd ever talked to anyone else in my life. He was probably over 30 years old by now, so I didn't ride him much anymore. We'd go out for walks, the three of us, Barnaby, Big Black Jack and me. He'd walk beside me, his whiskery old face close to mine, and we'd talk. Well, I'd talk, and I'd talk to the families of animals in the compound as well. Auntie Meg wouldn't have approved of it, of course. You talk to them, you only gentle them, she said, and gentle them, and they won't survive in the wild. but they seemed to like me talking to them, and they went off when I released them just the same, and most of them didn't come back, so it was fine. Everything was fine for a short while at least. Then the strangest, saddest thing happened. I went out into Big Black Jack's paddock one summer morning, early, carrying a bucket of water to fill up their trough. I did it every morning, and usually Big Black Jack and Barnaby would come wandering over for a pat and a few words and a drink, of course. This particular morning, they didn't come, so I went looking for them. I found Big Black Jack lying stretched out on the ground. He'd died. Barnaby was standing over him, his head hanging low. It took me all morning to bury Big Black Jack, Barnaby watching me all the time. He never drank a drop after that, never ate a thing, just stood by where I'd buried Big Black Jack, and he pined. He'd gone too within a few weeks. I was out there burying him in the paddock when I heard a car coming down the farm track. The man in the suit said he was a solicitor from Sydney. He was perfectly polite and proper. He simply told me that I had to move out, there wasn't any great hurry, he said. I could stay a couple of more months. Then he told me something that shouldn't have surprised me, but it did nonetheless. Auntie Meg's had a son, the one in the photograph I'd seen all those years before, but that she wouldn't talk about. There'd been a falling out years and years ago, the solicitor said, and they hadn't spoken since. Auntie Meg's hadn't left a will, so everything she owned, the house and the farm and the furniture, it all went to her son. That was the law. The son, it seemed, wanted nothing to do with the property. He just wanted to sell it. Of course I could stay if I bought it. I told him I didn't have the money for that. Then I asked him what would happen about all the animals. He said they belonged to the son as well. Everything did. I didn't stay 2 months. I didn't stay 2 weeks. I just stayed a few days. That's all it took. I gave the nanny goat to the next door farmer and walked out into the bush every day with an ever-decreasing cavalcade of little animals following me. The last one to go was a joey. I always wondered, if I rushed him, whether he was quite ready. He was very small but very independent-minded. When he hopped off into the bush, I just turned and walked away quickly. I looked around only once and he was gone. I hope he was all right. I left the next morning, passed by the hill, Marty's hill, Auntie Meg's hill, to say my last goodbyes. I promised Marty that I would go looking for Kitty one day, and I told Auntie Meg's that all her family of animals were back in the wild now where they belonged. Then I went on my way. I had a small suitcase with a few clothes in it and one photo of us all together, and I had my lucky key round my neck. I didn't look back. I went to Sydney again because I had only one thought in my mind now, to go to sea. I got lucky, or so it seemed at the time anyway. I found a job straight away on a fishing trawler, and I didn't think twice, I just signed on. We'd be fishing the Southern Ocean for tuna mostly. I didn't care what it was for. I was just happy to be out there again, to feel the heaving seas about me, to watch the birds sailing the wind above me, to see the stars. You can see the stars better at sea than anywhere else. Then we began fishing. Most people have never seen a tuna that wasn't in a tin. I certainly hadn't, not before I went fishing for them. If they'd have seen what I saw during the months and years that followed, they could never take a tin of tuna off the supermarket shelf again, let alone eat the fish inside. A tuna is a beautiful, shining creature, for me the most magnificent of all the fish, and huge too. Day after day out on the trawler, I'd watch them lying there on the deck, thrashing about, and they weren't alone. Albatross, turtles, dolphins, sharks, they were all taken out of the ocean and caught. No one seemed to mind what we were doing, just as long as we brought enough tuna back to port. And I didn't just stand by and watch. I was as guilty as everyone else. Whatever you wanted to call it, I played my part. But it paid well, and I was at sea where I wanted to be. I took the money, I stayed at sea, but I wasn't proud of myself, and the longer I stayed, the more troubled I became by what I was doing. None of the others seemed to bother about what they were catching. On the contrary, the more we caught, the happier they were. They weren't bad blokes, they were just trying to earn a living. We all got on well enough. When we weren't fishing or sleeping or eating, we were playing card games. I liked them a lot. I liked them too much. I was actually quite good at it, and besides, It was totally absorbing. It took my mind off everything. But each game was only a brief respite. Soon enough I was back up on the deck, doing my fishing. I stuck it out as long as I could, but after a few years I'd had enough. Just the sight of another tuna made me feel sick. One night on the way back to port, I was lying in my bunk unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see hordes and hordes of tuna thrashing about on the decks. I knew I couldn't do another trip. I clutched my lucky key and swore to myself that as soon as I got back to Sydney, I'd do what I should have done years before, what I promised Marty I'd do. I'd go to England and look for my sister Kitty. I had every intention of doing it too, but the others wanted a night out on the town, and I went along. By the time we got back in the early hours of the morning, I'd spent all the money that I'd earned. There was no way I could afford a plane fare to England now. I find it difficult to explain myself all these years later, why I did what I did next. I think I must have had just three things on my mind. I needed money, and I still wanted more than anything to be at sea. And I didn't even want to go fishing again. I remember walking down the streets of Sydney, my suitcase in my hand. I happened to look up and saw a face smiling down at me from a poster. The man was in uniform, a naval uniform, and he looked just like Mick in the photo of him back at the Ark. He wore the same uniform too, the same peak cap, the same Royal Australian Navy badge. The sailor inside the recruitment office, that's what it was, beckoned me in. It was as simple as that, and as usual, I thought my lucky key had done it again. I'd joined the Navy. I'd have regular money in my pocket. I'd be at sea. Perfect! I signed on the dotted line, and within a couple of months I was back on board a ship. A very different kind of ship. A destroyer. I never read newspapers much, hardly ever watched the television either. I didn't pay much attention to the world outside, not in those days. If I had, maybe I would have seen it coming. A couple of years later, we were sailing off to war. The Vietnam War. My goodness me, what a life he leads. So, one day fishing boats, next day war boats, and he's off with the Australian Army. We will see where his adventures take him tomorrow. Right, time for you to get on with whatever it is you're doing today, whatever work you're catching up with or starting. Work hard and make sure that you upload everything that you need to onto Seesaw. Okay, take care, bye bye.